The wind picked up just after midnight. It swept across the surface of Lake Michigan like a warning, brushing past the sails of ships in the dark and rustling through the rigging with a low, uneasy groan. On the water, waves began to swell, slow at first, then rising higher with each gust. The stars blinked behind a thick veil of cloud. And out on that vast lake, in the early morning hours of September 8th, 1860, a grand passenger steamer cut through the blackness, unaware that she was being watched, and that her end was already set in motion. Her name was the Lady Elgin. She was beautiful, long, sleek, and shining in the flicker of her lanterns. One of the finest sidewheel steamers on the Great Lakes, a floating hotel adorned with polished brass, heavy drapes, fine woodwork, and the soft glow of oil lamps dancing against carved ceilings. On this voyage, she was filled with people, about 400 in total. Most were Irish Americans from Milwaukee, members of the Union Guards militia, along with their families, supporters, and musicians. They had chartered the Lady Elgin to attend a political rally in Chicago in support of Stephen A. Douglas, who was running for president against Abraham Lincoln. For many of the passengers, the trip was a blend of politics and celebration, a weekend of speeches, parades, and unity. They had left Milwaukee on the 6th of September. By the 7th, the festivities were in full swing. But by the night of the 7th, they were on their way home, tired, happy, and eager to return to their lives. The Lady Elgin departed Chicago in deteriorating weather. Captain Jack Wilson, a respected and experienced sailor, was at the helm. He was familiar with these waters. But Lake Michigan was fickle, sometimes as serene as glass, other times violently unforgiving. That night, it was the latter. Rain swept across the decks in sheets. The wind roared louder. Visibility was poor. And yet, the steamer pressed on, her twin paddle wheels churning through whitecaps, her engines groaning against the weight of the storm. Meanwhile, a much smaller vessel, the schooner Augusta, was sailing in the opposite direction. She was a two-masted lumber carrier, loaded down with heavy timbers bound for Chicago. Her crew was weary. Their navigation lights were dimmed by wind and rain. Her captain, Darius Malott, strained to see ahead. And then, at 2:30 a.m., it happened. In the distance, Malott saw lights. He wasn't sure what they belonged to until it was too late. The Augusta, under full sail and moving fast with the wind, collided with the Lady Elgin. The point of impact was just behind the steamer's port paddle wheel. The sound was horrific, splintering wood, screeching metal, and the unmistakable cry of panic as passengers were thrown from their beds. The Lady Elgin shuddered violently. Captain Wilson ran to assess the damage. The Augusta, having struck her broadside, rebounded and disappeared into the storm. Her crew later claimed they tried to assess the damage from a distance, but didn't turn back. On board the Lady Elgin, the truth was obvious. The ship was mortally wounded. The collision had torn a massive hole in the hull, and water was flooding in faster than any pump could handle. Captain Wilson ordered the crew to begin bailing immediately. They used buckets, barrels, anything they could find. But it was hopeless. Within minutes, the vessel was listing hard to port. Wilson shouted for calm. He ordered lifeboats lowered, but the chaos had taken over. Men were shouting, women were screaming, children clung to their parents as the deck tilted farther. Some passengers leapt overboard in desperation, thinking they could swim to safety. They were wrong. The waves tossed them like driftwood. Others tried to hang on, gripping railings, crouching beside bulkheads, praying the ship would stay afloat long enough to be rescued. But the Lady Elgin had minutes left. She broke apart just before 3 a.m. Her midsection snapped like a twig under the weight of water. The hurricane deck separated from the hull and floated briefly. Survivors clung to it, dozens of them, hoping it would hold until daylight. One raft, a makeshift platform of cabin debris, carried 18 people for over 4 hours. Wave after wave crashed over them. Several were swept away. Some died from exhaustion and hypothermia before rescue ever came. For those who made it into the lake, survival became a matter of brutal endurance. There were no life jackets. There were barely enough lifeboats. The water was cold, the storm unrelenting. Some survivors were dashed against floating wreckage or sucked beneath the surface by their own heavy clothes. Others managed to grab onto spars, barrels, anything that floated. As dawn broke, the shoreline near Winnetka, Illinois, revealed a horror. The lake was littered with bodies. Some were still alive, gasping, coughing up lake water. Others had been claimed by the waves. Local residents ran to the beach to help, and among them was one man who would become a legend. Edward W. Spencer, a 23-year-old seminary student at Northwestern University, was among the first on the scene. He tied a rope around his waist, anchored it to a post, and dove into the surf. Again and again, he swam out, sometimes hundreds of feet, grabbing drowning victims and dragging them back to shore. Some were unconscious. Some fought him in fear. Some were dead by the time he reached the beach. 17 times he went out, 17 lives saved. By the end, he collapsed on the sand. His body never fully recovered. He would be confined to a wheelchair for much of his remaining life. But he never regretted it. And yet, years later, when asked what haunted him most, he said, "I rescued 17. Not one came back to say thank you." The tragedy stunned the Midwest. More than 300 people were dead. It was the worst loss of life on the Great Lakes in peacetime history up to that point. Milwaukee was plunged into mourning. The Irish-American community had been devastated. Entire families wiped out. Parish priests read dozens of last rites. The Union Guards, once 80 strong, were reduced to a handful of survivors. Funerals stretched for days. Mass graves were dug. And the question everyone asked, how could this happen, went unanswered. There were investigations, hearings, finger-pointing. The Augusta had survived and reached Chicago. Captain Malott insisted he had done everything possible, that the weather had masked the Lady Elgin's position, and the collision was unavoidable. He claimed the steamer had not properly illuminated her running lights. Others disagreed. Some witnesses said the Augusta had shown no effort to alter course, that she sailed off into the night after the crash, that no aid had been rendered, no criminal charges were filed. The laws of the time were vague, and maritime accidents were often chalked up to fate. Captain Wilson, hailed as a hero by many, had died in the sinking, going down with his ship while helping passengers escape. In the wake of the disaster, there were calls for reform. Maritime safety regulations on the Great Lakes were antiquated, many dating back to the 1830s. But even so, little was immediately done. It would take future disasters to finally prompt sweeping changes. But the legacy of the Lady Elgin remained. For decades, the wreckage rested in shallow water, picked at by scavengers and storms. In 1989, the wreck was rediscovered. Divers found pieces of the paddle wheel, sections of the hull, and personal effects, shoes, combs, and fragments of instruments carried by the Union Guard band. Many of the remains had long since been claimed by the lake. Today, a historical marker stands near the shoreline in Winnetka. It overlooks the water where bodies once washed up, where desperate survivors clung to life, where a young man with a rope and a prayer became a hero, and where, for just a moment, the quiet surface of Lake Michigan revealed how quickly joy can turn to terror, and how fragile even the finest ship can be. The Lady Elgin sailed into that storm with pride, elegance, and purpose. She sank beneath it with screams, splintered wood, and the weight of 300 souls. But she is not forgotten. Not in Milwaukee, not on the shore. Not in the cold, still silence of the lake where she rests. Thank you for listening to the Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.